Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today. And I welcome you for today's webinar on gender responsive climate finance perspectives from India. So, as you know, that climate finance is widely recognized as a critical enabler of effective climate action. However, despite growing global commitments, its scale, accessibility, and distribution remain deeply inadequate, particularly for developing countries like India that face disproportionate climate risk. At the same time, the way climate finance is designed and delivered has significant implications for equity. Historically, these systems have been largely gender blind, overlooking structural barriers that limit gendered access to resources, decision making spaces, and opportunities. In a country like India, where climate vulnerability intersects with existing gender inequalities, this gap becomes even more pronounced. There is also a lot of fuzziness around the understanding of climate finance, with persistent gaps in understanding its scope, mechanism, and practical application. Also, building on our engagements and other initiatives that we have also observed a lot of interest and inquisitiveness in exploring this area, a lot of questions around climate finance. So it is in this context, today's webinar, we aim to build foundational clarity on climate finance while also fostering dialogue on where we currently stand in integrating gender and what systematic transformations are needed to make climate finance more inclusive, equitable, and truly gender responsive. So, moving forward, I warmly invite you all to join me in welcoming our esteemed panel of experts. Dr. Janak Raj, Senior Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, Ms. Neha Misra, Program Lead, Climate Economics and Finance Program at World Resources Institute, India, Ms. Payal Negi, Manager, Climate Policy Initiative, and Ms. Divya Gaur, Program Lead, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I will take a few more minutes to introduce the panel, and then I will hand it over to you, Divya, to carry on with the discussion. So, starting with Dr. Janak Raj, he's a senior fellow and leads the macroeconomic segment in growth, finance, and development vertical at CSEP. He also works specifically on interlinkages between economic growth and human development, fiscal federalism in the health sector, climate finance, and multilateral development bank reforms. He is currently also a member of the JM Financial Center for Financial Research of IIM Udaipur. He has more than 4 decades of work experience, including in the Reserve Bank of India, the International Monetary Fund, and the Ministry of Finance. Dr. Raj served as an executive director in Reserve Bank of India and as a member of its statutory monetary policy committee. He also served as principal advisor of Monetary Policy Department and International Department of RBI, and he did its Department of Economic Policy and Research. At the IMF Washington, D.C., he was senior advisor to the executive director of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. He served as an RBI nominee director to the governing board of formerly Bombay Stock Exchange and as a senior consultant in Department of Financial Services, Ministry of Finance. Dr. Janak also holds a PhD in economics from IIT Bombay. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Janak, and thank you for joining the discussion. Ms. Neha Mishra works to advance sustainable and equitable finance strategies at national and subnational levels. Her focus is on mobilizing climate-aligned capital to drive inclusive growth and resilience. Previously, Neha also worked as a senior vice president at Impact Investment Exchange, where she led initiatives for a landmark $150 million gender and climate issuance across the global south. She brings over 13 years of experience in technology, sustainability, and finance, having worked with corporates and startups in India and the US, including a stint on the Wall Street in New York. Her experience also includes working with LTSE, SEBI, and others as securities market expert. She holds degree in engineering and management and has been recognized with honors such as CII PwC Top 100 Women in Innovation and the IIT Madras Young Alumni Award. A very warm welcome to you, Neha, and thank you for joining the discussion. Ms. Payal Negi is a yeah. Ms. Payal Negi is a sustainability and climate finance professional with nearly a decade of experience in climate change research, ESG analysis, and sustainable finance. She has joined the Center for Sustainable Finance at Climate Policy Initiative as manager, where she contributes to advancing data-driven insights and policy solutions to accelerate green investment. Before CPI, Payal worked with HSBC Global Research, leading cross-sectoral research on carbon market, transition risk, and climate and ESG policy development. Her analytical work has supported investor decision making and thought leadership on sustainable finance and adaptation resilience. Earlier in her career, she contributed to climate vulnerability assessment at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Payal holds MSc in Climate Science and Policy from Terry School of Advanced Studies. A very warm welcome to you, Payal, and thank you for joining the discussion. Uh, Moving to Divya, Ms. Divya Gaur is a social impact professional focused on working towards augmenting the positive socioeconomic environmental changes at the grassroots level with a data-driven approach. At the council, Divya is part of Powering Livelihoods team, looks into the impact measurement along with supporting the integration of gender inclusivity in design of the initiative. Previously, Divya has worked with Sattva Consulting as a social impact consultant in her impact measurement and advisory team, where she evaluated multiple development programs implemented by social sector organizations and helped in maximizing their impact on the ground through data-driven decision making. Divya is also an entrepreneurship enthusiast and in the past has conceptualized ideas at the intersection of women's empowerment and sustainability, such as zero waste and sustainable clothing. Divya also supports social enterprises that focus on gender inclusion with respect to design and implementation. A very warm welcome to you, Divya. Thank you for joining the discussion. And now over to you.
Thank you, Chetna. Thank you, for those introduction. A very good afternoon to everybody joining us. First of all, thanks to She Changes Climate for organizing this. It's my pleasure to moderate this very pertinent session today on climate finance. And while Chetna was introducing the panelist, there is so much of experience right now in the room to learn from. So I am looking forward to actually learning more than moderating from our esteemed panelists on how climate finance can be strengthened in Indian context, can be leveraged and made more equitable. So thanks to all the panelists for making time for this. So finance, while I'm from economics background, but I think the finance as a word has always felt too technical to me as well. And I think always I've heard from a lay person that, oh, that is too technical. And also, sometimes we hear that it's very boring, right? It's all about number crunching. But in this session today, we will ensure that we break it down so that we can strengthen our basics and we can, all of us can take back something and integrate the knowledge that we gained today into our work. And we will also keep the discussion fun and engaging and rooted in real examples so that finance, especially climate finance, it feels like a business for everyone and not just those with technical skills. But before I begin, I want to, and of course, the researcher in me wants to put forth some stark, like a stark fact and a beacon of hope to give us some perspective. So the stark fact is that while we celebrate that global climate finance has finally crossed the $2 trillion mark, right? But a recent report commissioned by COP presidencies shows that developing nations roughly need $2.4 trillion every year. And the current international flow to adaptation finance has actually been just $26 billion. And on the top of that, of whatever has flowed, only 3% of all of the official development assistance on climate had gender equality as the primary objective. So despite being on the front lines of ensuring resilience, women remain largely invisible, more so in developing countries. So that's the stark fact. But the hope is that if women had the same access to financing resources or financial resources as men, agricultural yields could go up by 20 to 30%. Now, this isn't just a win for equity; it's a win for the planet. Um, so, with this hope and with this dark fact, we will begin our discussion with the panelists because climate finance is then not just about moving money. It's about moving the needle for people who need it the most. In this context, women. So I'd like to start with Dr. Janak. Dr. Janak, given your experience and clearly given these numbers that we have, we are missing out on the most critical aspect of solving this behemoth, which is climate crisis, if we do not focus enough on climate finance, and also just do not rely on the flow that's coming, but also how in the Indian context can we strengthen the climate finance, so that we have enough finance flowing in the ecosystem, which can ensure climate resilience in the country. But like I mentioned, climate finance as a term is often misunderstood or too technical. So, my first question to you would be, if we could break it down for our audience today, from a macroeconomic and institutional perspective, what exactly is climate finance and what are its key components, which the audiences must understand today to engage meaningfully with it?
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Divya. I would also like to, join you in, expressing my thanks for inviting me for this event. This She Climate Changes Climate. I was very keen to understand. I was very keen to participate in this webinar to understand the gender part of it. So now let me come to the question which you have raised. As you said that no, climate finance is a commonly used term nowadays, but it's rarely understood clearly. But it's very important that we understand this term clearly so that we can all engage in any discussion on climate finance meaningfully. Climate finance, before I come to climate finance term, no, I would like to go to the commitment which was made at the Paris Agreement, that we need to limit the global warming to below 2%, 2 degrees Celsius pre-industrial levels, ideally 1.5. So in order to achieve, what is that it tells us? It tells us that we need to contain green emission of greenhouse gases. You know, we have, industry, we have power plants, we have transport. They all emit, greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and other gases. So, in order to reduce the emission of these greenhouse gases, we need money. So that's number one. So this is what we call mitigation. So it has climate finance has two aspects. One is mitigation. It's basically moving to a low carbon economy. I will explain in detail, but I'm just giving you the broad idea to start with. And then is adaptation. So let me explain mitigation, though it's to move to a low carbon economy, but it means different thing for different sectors. So as I mentioned, there are different sectors which emit carbon dioxide. Take, for example, power sector. Now, in order to reduce carbon emissions in the power sector, you need to switch over to renewables, like solar power plants or wind energy. But in order to set up those plants, you need money. But at the same time, you will be needing less fossil fuel based sources of power. So when we talk about climate finance, we basically talk about additional climate finance, basically which will be incurring to take care of the carbon emissions. So you have more expenditure on the fossil renewable sources of energy, but you will also be saving on fossil fuel based sources of power. So the difference between the two will be climate finance. But let me stress this point. This is the difference which most of the studies have ignored. All the estimates which have been arrived at, I have not come across any study which has tried to take this difference. Let me give you an example. We worked out the climate finance estimate for the power sector up to 2030. So our estimate for the renewable sources of energy, all renewable sources of energy, solar power, wind, hydro, biomass, nuclear. So our estimate based on actual projections by the government was a 90 billion US dollar up to 2030. But we will also be saving 43 billion US dollar on fossil fuel based sources of power. So technically it becomes to only 47 billion US dollar for the as climate finance. And if you add the cost of storage battery and cost of integration of renewables with the power grid, then the total cost comes to something like 57 billion US dollar up to 2030. So this is power sector. Same is the case with the road transport. We have done study for the road transport. So when you incur more expenditure on electric vehicles, you will also be saving money on internal combustion engine vehicles. So when we talk about the climate finance for mitigation, we need to take the difference between the two. Number one, but there are some hard to abate sectors like steel and cement. They also emit a lot of carbon emissions. So they operate on a different footing. For them, there is one technology called carbon capture and storage technology. It's a technology which is retrofitted on steel and power plants. It then captures the this thing carbon emission. Then they are transported and stored in a distant location where it is captured for all time to come. So in the case of steel and cement, so whatever money you are required to spend to mitigate CO2 in these two sectors becomes the entire thing becomes the climate finance. Because if you had not been caring for the climate change, you won't have been spending these money. In the past we have not spent money. Even now we are not spending any money on steel, cement and steel sector. So this is another requirement. So then you also need to create carbon sink. You not only have to actively reduce carbon emission, but you also need to create carbon sink. For that also you need money. So insofar as mitigation is concerned, this is how the climate finance is led. Now let me come to the adaptation. For adaptation, we need to prepare people. We need to prepare people, to enable them to withstand the extreme weather conditions. So we need to develop their resilience. In order to develop their resilience, you need to spend money. Let me give you an example. If you need to build a road, road is also development finance. You build any road, it's a development finance. But if you are building a road which is specifically to take care of extreme weather condition, like you want to keep its level high so that even if there are floods, people are able to pass smoothly, there is no issue. So if you want to raise the level of that road, especially to take care of extreme weather conditions, that means you are spending some extra additional money, so that becomes adaptation finance. So any money which will be spent on adaptation finance, it will be very difficult to distinguish. Of course, this is the parameter which we need to keep in mind while distinguishing, but it also becomes a development finance. But when we talk about adaptation, that means it's over and above the money spent specifically to address extreme weather conditions resulting due to climate change. Now, there is another concept called the loss and damage. So even though you have developed very resilient infrastructure or ecosystem, but still it could be damaged because of extreme weather conditions. No infrastructure can be foolproof. So if you are spending money to take care of the loss and damage which has occurred, despite the fact that you have developed resilient infrastructure, so that would be called loss and damage. So it's a climate finance, mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So the more money you spend on in developing resilient infrastructure, the less would be the need for loss and damage. Similarly, if the more money you spend on mitigation, they are all linked: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. The more money you spend on mitigation, that means you are basically containing the emission of greenhouse gases. That means there will be fewer incidents of extreme weather condition. So you will need to spend less on adaptation. So they're all three are linked. So this is insofar as quantitative part is concerned. There is another definition of climate finance which is used in a very narrow sense, I would say. Like at COP15, if I remember correctly, at Copenhagen in 2009, developed countries committed to contribute $100 billion every year for emerging and developing economies up to 2020. many people got confused. This is also climate finance, but this is in a very narrow sense. So many people, when they talk about climate finance, they just refer to this 100 billion US dollar, which was committed by, developed economies. So this is insofar as quantitative part is concerned. Now let me come to quality part of it. It has a lot of significance. When we come to quality of climate finance, we have basically two different aspects in mind. One, how much money we are spending for mitigation and how much money we are spending for adaptation. Lot of money is going towards mitigating. Whatever climate finance is happening, most of it is going for mitigation. As you were mentioning, a very small amount of money is going for, I think, of the total climate finance which has been investment which has been made in the system at a global level, only about 10% has gone for mitigation. So when we talk about the quality of uh, climate finance, it basically means that we should have Paris Agreement say we should have 50% for mitigation and 50% for uh, mitigation and 50% for adaptation. But it's also a fact that the requirement for mitigation are much larger than those for adaptation. So I'm not really sure when we say 50-50, does it really becomes 50-50? That's one part on which there is no clarity. So there is another aspect of quality of climate finance. Climate finance has to be, many people say that it's an additional expenditure which emerging economies and developing economies are required to incur. So they should be more in the form of concessional loans, such as grants or equity, and less in the form of debt. So when second aspect of quality of finance is that it should be more in terms of grants and concessional finance and less in terms of loan, because many countries in Africa particularly, they are highly indebted. So since they are highly indebted, so they are not able to take more loans and expose themselves to various risks and become vulnerable. In fact, I must say that some countries have refused to take adaptation climate finance because it was being dispersed in the form of, it was being given in the form of loans, which these countries don't want. These are the broad areas of climate finance in so many terms is concerned. I can come back later when there are questions. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. That was really informative and felt like a quick crash course into understanding different facets of climate finance. And you beautifully broke it down into mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage, and how the three are interlinked. I'll come back to you on how do we plan this at the macroeconomic level and what it means for India. But moving to Neha. So Neha, from what Dr. Janak just touched upon, the three aspects of climate finance, and focusing more so in context of the communities at the last mile or development, right? WRI has been working proactively on strengthening climate finance systems on the ground at the subnational levels. What are the challenges and gap that you see in integrating innovative climate finance mechanisms at the subnational level or at the last mile, especially for women and generally excluded groups like tribal groups?
Wonderful. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, He Changes Climate, for organizing this very pertinent discussion, much like the we said in the very beginning. And thanks a lot to Dr. Janak for sort of laying the context so well and helping people understand climate finance, because I'll now come to the question that you posited when you say that at the last mile, how do we explain climate finance to people? So if folks like us having some sort of, challenges or a little bit of apprehension in general, what I've seen is finance is an industry which is sometimes labeled in a slightly more complicated way, which is why in general, the nature of finance is something that can deter people. Talk about the concept of climate finance, because now you have climate, which is again something that very few people understand, and then you attach finance to it. So what we've seen, and particularly I'll allude to two things. One is, of course, WRI India's work, and we're very proud to be working at a subnational level. Much of my former experience before WRI India was international. I worked in the US setting up a sustainable stock exchange. Then I led the SPO for a gender bond, which I'll come to how it was labeled. But when we started working with WRI India at a subnational level, the reality of what we say as locally led adaptation efforts, locally led involvement, how does finance impact folks at the last mile started to hit home a little bit more. So, very recently, it was last month at the Mumbai Climate Week, where we revealed one of my first pieces of work at WRI India, which was Maharashtra's climate finance access and mobilization strategy. So, when we were tasked with this effort to build a strategy for a subnational level, particularly for Maharashtra, it was like the coin had two sides. One is Maharashtra as a state, for example, is slightly on the forward foot when it comes to finance. So, folks understand finance. There have been ULBs that have raised bonds, particularly green bonds. So they do understand that the state, for example, has a need, and for those joining internationally, every state in India comes out with their state specific plans for climate change, which are in short called SAP-CCs. Now, once the SAP-CC outlines that, okay, by 2030, you need X amount of capital. In this case, Maharashtra, for example, needs 2,97,000 lakh crores of money, so 2 lakh, nearly 3 lakh crore in terms of capital. You know that much like Dr. Janak said, that adaptation doesn't receive a lot of private finance. So you have all of your public money that is coming there. How do you, A, bring in more capital than what is currently being deployed? And B, accelerate it, because we know we are fighting against time. I'm glad Dr. Janak sort of brought us back to think about a world where we could again think about 1.5. But the way things have moved, we're sort of hitting towards 2 degrees, literally. So, how do you sort of mobilize these different sources of financing and also make the discourse compatible with the language that people will understand at a taluka level or at a district level? How do you do that? So, that's a big disconnect. So, one of the first things I remember was, in fact, this person in Marathi asked us in one of our first consultations is, Madam, what do you mean is climate finance? We don't understand what is climate finance. We have these priorities. This has to be done, otherwise, the budget won't be utilized. And then we also have to give the forecast for the next few years. So, how do you sort of align what is climate, what is highly aligned to climate, what is mid-aligned, and what is less aligned? So, fortunately, the year prior to we engaged in this initiative for the strategy, we had actually done a tagging exercise, a climate budget tagging exercise for the state of Maharashtra, where we had analyzed their state budget and arrived at a number of about 9% using UNDP's methodology, CPEIR methodology, which was, yeah, these kind of activities have money which are going for initiatives that are linked to climate or have a positive effect on the climate. So that sensitization helped the audience understand that this percentage of my money is actually going towards climate. But now I need this much more, which has been identified in the SAP-CC. So how do I then look at other ways of aggregating finance? So when we started to when we launched, we had more municipal corporations come up and say, hey, we also want to raise a bond. And then, the concept of, okay, we have a smaller project, but transaction cost of a bond is very high. So can 2, 3 initiatives come together to sort of think about or conceptualize the bond? So it started with that effort, but when we actually built out the strategy, and I'll post the link here for the audience, we tried to make it absolutely simple in terms of what is adaptation finance, what is mitigation finance, what kind of activities as aligned in the SAP-CC sort of corroborate towards adaptation or mitigation or may have an impact where both things are being covered. So which is what we call cross-cutting. So the our initiative, and this is where She Changes Climate, and I think Chetna, great job on bringing us together, is to simplify these things. so that more and more people can understand the language around it, simplify it, and more importantly, convey it in terms that people at the last mile understand. And the same thing we experienced, Divya, just to sort of sum it up, is when we did this climate finance workshop in Madhya Pradesh. And very interestingly, we said we come with these big numbers from UNFCCC and all of this. But for example, there's a lady working in the animal husbandry department, and she's already doing some work. And I said, ma'am, you talk about your climate finance initiatives. And she said, no, no, we don't know anything. And she was very scared and apprehensive and very, very intellectual lady. But I said, you just talk about what you are doing. Okay. And then she came around and she said, we are doing this for green fodder. We are doing these kind of initiatives for sericulture. The fisheries lady came in, and then eventually we were wrapping up the discussion, and I had a tough time getting the first few started. But by the end of it, we had one lady sort of slowly raising her hand from the horticulture department. Ma'am, we also have these initiatives. Do these also classify as climate finance? So it is upon us to convey it in a language. And after the event, they actually came to me and said that the way we look at our work has shifted. And women have that power. I intrinsically feel that, of course, it is a known fact that climate disproportionately, impacts gender. Climate disproportionately impacts a lot of the way systems are structured. So our financial systems really need to evolve. So for perspective, before WRI, when I was working on what is called an SPO, the second party opinion for a bond issuance, which is interestingly called an orange bond in this case, and orange because, and thankfully not pink, but orange because the SDG color 5 is orange, which stands for gender equality. And that's where we realize that you can make it as simple as, for example, you are lending to an NBFC. How many women are in the leadership? How many women employees are there? And finally, how many women beneficiaries are there? So it could be something very simple people start to understand. Another bond issuance that I studied at the time was which was designed to impact people from Syria. And retrospectively, the same bond was labeled as an orange bond because of the disproportionate higher impact it had on women. So those are ways. Another organization in Latin America, for example, is called ProMujer, which again is well known for their gender bonds across Argentina, which are then listed on the Luxembourg Green Exchange, is to not look at women as a subset of our, what do we call as, make it more intrinsic at every step of the curve. So once that systemic shift,
I think, Neha, we are having some kind of a network issue at your end.
Yeah, I thought it's just me.
till where you heard, but I'm sorry, my Zoom just restarted. So what I was saying is the only thing that I want to conclude with, Divya, and my apologies again to the audience as well as the organizers, is that as we need to start looking women or gender or minorities not as a subset of a GSSS bond ecosystem, and possibly a very small minuscule set under gender bonds or social bonds, but making them more intrinsically part of the system. And that's where WRI India again is very, very good at local led efforts, whether it is with MSMEs, whether it is on industrial decarbonization, whether it is on climate finance, is bringing that audience to the front and making them part of the discourse and the dialogue. And that's how perspectives and narratives change. So I don't know how much of it you got, but maybe I'll circle back when the time is opportune, and I'll hand over to my next panelist for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neha. And I love how the discussion is flowing from concept to application, especially at the very closer to the community. So, and also, Neha, probably in the next set of questions, I would love it if you could elaborate on what all does a SAP CC entail. What are the sectors you could look at, and what does climate finance mean for those sectors? So I think that will help our audience also imagine what could happen at the subnational level. But moving to you, Payal, and like Neha was highlighting, right? People at the ground do not know what climate finance is, or do not know how their work is adding to what we are actually trying to do, right? Or where are the women, or where is the data, essentially, right? So CPI's work is known for like data-driven insights, and if we were to go by that phrase that we often talk in context of data, is what gets measured gets managed. So today, what are the data blind spots that we have, especially in Indian context? You can also bring in the global context, that actually is limiting us from seeing exactly how climate finance is integrated into what women are doing, or where women are missing, right, in the whole discourse.
Thank you, Divya. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks a lot, Janak sir, for setting the context for climate finance, and Neha for your insight from WRI and local-led efforts that you rightly explained. And taking from what you explained, what climate finance means, and tagging climate finance, but let me start with a very fundamental statement. Data is sort of the lifeblood of effective climate finance deployment. It is what turns ambition and need into action, allowing any financial institution to allocate resources where it's needed, but based on evidence. And to start with some data pointers, Divya, you had mentioned earlier as well, in FY 21-22, India's average climate finance flows reached approximately $65 billion, of which there was a complete lack of gender disaggregated data or tracking climate finance flows for women-led enterprises. Therefore, it became extremely difficult to quantify benefits to WLEs, of which approximately 95% are informal and credit constrained. Even globally, just 2-3% of climate finance flows are explicitly gender tagged, and 5% of blended finance transactions intentionally integrate into gender considerations. And by what you mentioned, the logic, what gets managed, measured gets managed, and in an eye of a financier, what gets tracked gets financed. So gender tagging, I feel, remains the biggest blind spot here. And particularly in India, gender climate data is sparse mainly because of how the statistical, climate, and sectoral systems are designed and governed, and not because gender is irrelevant in any which way. So let's take example of climate data systems like IWD, CWC, IMD, CWC, etc., and socioeconomic platforms such as NSS, Census. They're designed so separately that very little data is collected that directly links climate hazards, exposure, and impacts to gendered outcomes at the same time and place. In fact, even disaster loss databases also often record total deaths, total injuries, losses, and damage, but not systematically by sex, age, caste, disability, or any livelihood category. So it is very hard to quantify how many women, men, and other genders are affected by each event. Hence, hard to quantify the financial losses associated with these as well. So if the financial losses are not quantified, institutional investors, any sort of investors are not going to get the numbers. And many climate relevant administrative data sets such as water, agriculture, health, social protection also do not get captured by beneficiary sex, or they, even if they do, they are captured in a very inconsistent way, making it difficult for platforms like us to aggregate, compare across states, or link to climate variables. As Neha mentioned about SAP CCs definitely acknowledge that women are more vulnerable to climate impacts, but they rarely translate this into specific indicator, baseline, base, or monitoring framework that require gender disaggregated climate data. So gender in climate policy is still largely equated with women as a homogeneous group, with little attention to intersecting identities like caste, class, tribal status, migrant status, etc. So there is no demand signal for more granular intersectional climate data. But I would also like to talk something from a corporate lens. Let's also take examples of current frameworks like the BRSR reporting framework for corporates. They track environmental performances and very limited gender data, and they don't connect the dots to leadership demographics. So, a common blind spot for corporates is companies often treat gender superficially or narrowly, missing critical intersections with social divisions, disabilities, geographies. And India, women, mainly from marginalized communities, face systemic barriers to formal employment and leadership. Basically, companies treat gender as a compliance requirement and not as a strategic variable in climate finance discussions. But the fix may be gradual. If we talk about the fix of these blind spots, these are gradual, but on papers they are pretty straightforward. That is expanding taxonomies and mandating gender tagging as a practice. Also, can be drawn from like 2x criteria standards, and all of this would give more flavor to the data, unlock blended finance, and ensure that money is allocated to empower women-led ventures at scale and done right. I can talk more about any live examples on this, but over to you, Divya.
Thank you so much, Payal, for bringing the data gap into the perspective as well. And this is very essential, the gender tagging part, and possibly we will discuss with you more on why is this missing, right? Is it the motivation gap? Is it not being able to understand what we are losing out on if we are missing on this? But in our like the program that I'm currently leading, Powering Livelihoods, just because we made it, kind of made it compulsory in the sense that we had to record that gender data for our program. We ensured that whatever loans or credit we are mobilizing for women to own, let's say a productive use asset on renewable energy, there is a finance or loan to going to her as well, right? So those things help, but we'll discuss more on why is this missing. But back to Janak sir on so you mentioned that you've recently released 2 studies on estimating climate finance requirements, right? And also just hearing Payal where she was mentioning that right now we are probably not able to quantify losses very well on, especially the financial losses very well for sectors like water, health, agriculture as well, right? So my next question to you is if you could break down that study for us as well, like what were the key findings that emerged? Of course, you did touch upon on the mitigation side of it, what are these sectors and how much climate finance is needed. But just to elaborate on what kind of approach the study took and what kind of estimates are coming for India? What are these top sectors that we need to focus on from mitigation lens, from adaptation lens? And what kind of approach would really work for capital finance to flow in the right manner? Is it the bottom-up approach, top-down? What approach could truly work for us?
Yeah, thank you, Divya. Before I come to estimates, let me give a just broad overview of, I just explained in my previous intervention, the concept of climate finance. So I think next step is proper assessment of climate finance, because if we don't make proper assessment of climate finance, then if you need to raise resources, you'll be at loss, like how much resources you need. So it's very important to have precise estimate of climate finance, number 2. Number 3, another related aspect is, so after having estimated climate finance, then how do you mobilize resources? So since I'm a macroeconomist, let me tell you that we all talk about blended finance, green bonds and all, that's perfectly fine. But before we come to these instruments, we need to look at the resources available at the aggregate level. Okay, so if you don't have aggregate resources and adequate aggregate resources, then let me tell you, then the cost of raising bonds, green bonds, or through maybe bank credit, that would become quite prohibitive. So these are all four aspects which are related. Now let me come to the estimates. So we conducted two studies, one estimating climate finance requirement for India, and one climate finance estimates for 9 emerging market economies, all of which are part of G20. Okay, so this includes all BRICS economies, 5, Mexico, Turkey, Indonesia, and Argentina. So we conducted 9. So what was the motivation for us to do the study? So climate finance for me, I was in the Reserve Bank before, and then I started looking at climate finance just 3-4 years ago. So when I started looking at climate finance studies, to be very frank with you, I really couldn't understand most of the studies from where the numbers, how the numbers were arrived at, and what were the underlying methodologies. Most of the studies have not explained. Either they are not explained, or they are not sufficiently clearly explained, like what is the methodology they have followed to arrive at those estimates. And these numbers were in trillions of US dollars everywhere, including for the emerging market economies, and you take any group of economies, it was in trillions of US dollars. So that was the motivation for us to undertake that study. So our study, we followed a bottom-up approach, whereas all other studies were based on top-down approaches. We followed a bottom-up approach. We took 4 sectors, as I mentioned: road transport, power, steel, and cement. And then we conducted study for each of these sectors for all the 9 economies. And it was a hell lot of task for us to collect data on all these sectors, and we have covered everything. Like in the case of power sector, we have covered all fossil fuel based sources of power, and renewable sources of power like solar energy, wind energy, biomass, nuclear, hydro. We have taken into account everything. And everything is there in those 2 studies which I have talked about. So everything has been very clearly explained. The definition which you have adopted has been very clearly explained, and it has been done in a very transparent manner. And actually, we would like people to challenge us, like how have you arrived at those numbers, because everything is very clear. But so that was the background in which we undertook those studies. So let me tell you the estimates which we arrived at. For 9 economies, if you before our study was released, most of the estimates for emerging market and developing economies are in trillions of US dollar. Even now, the number which came in last COP, it was something like 2.7 trillion US dollar. And that number, of course, this was based on some study. And it was also indicated that almost half will come from domestic sources and half will come from external sources. This also has a huge implication. I will talk about it if we have time. No, we say that we need to get a lot of funding from external sources. Let me tell you, if you get a lot of capital from outside, it can play havoc with our economy. There are various reasons for that. I don't want to get into now, but if we get a time, I'll definitely like to explain that. So all numbers were in trillions of US dollars. So our study found for 9 economies, that number which were existing prior to our study were 2.2 to 3.5 trillion US dollar every year. Whereas we found the total requirement up to 2030 is 2.2 trillion US dollar for all the 9 economies. And this is up to 2030, which works out to 255 billion US dollar, or 0.6% of GDP every year. So much lower than that. And let me tell you, all other studies, the entire focus was on the energy sector. No study, to the best of my knowledge, has considered cement and steel sectors, and very few studies have considered even the road transport. So most of their estimates were focused largely on the energy sector. And for the energy sector, we find the requirements are not all that large for the reasons. There has been a sharp decline in solar panel prices, wind turbines, and there is also improvement in the capacity factor. Battery storage prices have declined. So our estimates are much lower at the aggregate level. But if you exclude China and India and Russia, they need 88% of the total climate finance requirement of the 2.2 trillion which I talked about. So other economies, they hardly need, as percent GDP is still quite significant, like 0.6, 0.7% of GDP. But in absolute term, the amount is not all that large. Let me come to India now. For India, we found up to 2030, our total requirement of climate finance it's only for mitigation for the four sectors. We have not considered adaptation. It's only 467 billion US dollar, which works out to something like 50 billion US dollar or 1.3% of GDP. So these estimates are much lower than all other estimates which have been arrived at, and they're all very transparent, as I explained earlier, and are rooted in micro data. Like all the numbers which we have arrived at are based on official projections which have been made by all the governments up to 2030 for each of the sectors. One crucial point I would like to point it out here is India is a growing economy. India's steel and cement requirements between 2023 and 2000, the data which we used was for 2023. So India's cement and steel requirements are expected to increase by 80%. Both steel and cement, and the carbon intensity of steel in India is one of the highest in the world. It's 2 point something, whereas the global average is 1.84 something. Unlike India, Chinese economy is slowing down. In the case of China, cement and steel productions are coming down. We had, discussion here in CCM, and then one of the, expert who had come from abroad, he pointed out that how is it that CO2 emissions are getting reduced at a much larger scale than it has been happening in India. So one of the major reasons for that is that Chinese economy is slowing down. If you see the latest numbers, it's below 5%, the estimate, the projection which they have made. So the point is that the requirements, if you go by the micro numbers, are not all that large. But if you go by the model-based numbers, they are large. But then we really don't understand those numbers until their methodologies are clearly explained. I will stop here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving that macro perspective and what it means for India and what it means for other emerging economies or growing economies that we have mapped. And of course, the numbers that we're looking at, of course, are big, but at the same time, I think the focus on not depending a lot on what could come from outside, but understanding what we could mobilize is a very strong perspective, and I think that needs to be taken forward. So moving to Neha, and I'm also conscious of time. We're already at 4:30, and there are already a few questions that I see in the Q&A. And I think there are some questions on, hi Neha, how did the Goshala lady use the green bonds? Right. And a lot of questions coming from a local upcycling ecosystem and how they could, leverage climate finance. So Neha, previously when you were speaking about SAPCC and how you kind of worked at the sub-national level to create that awareness and simplify climate finance for the state officials. For the audience here, could you break down SAPCC, what all it entails, and if, let's say, the bonds that you spoke of had to be integrated or leveraged by communities at the last mile, what does it mean? So if you could explain that, how a Goshala lady used a bond.
How do we take it forward?
Yeah. Yes. Could you hear me? So one is explaining that I think there is some lag. Is it me or is it everybody? Chetna, you can hear me?
I don't know. It could be me, but can you hear
Yeah,
me?
I can hear you. Now I can hear you, Neha. It was a bit of misconnection from your side.
Yeah, I don't know why it's acting up today. No, I think I get the context, and Divya, I'm mindful of time myself. So very briefly, and thanks to CEW for actually building out the SAPCC for Maharashtra, we actually just built on top of that. So the job of a state action plan on climate change is to not, the job is not to take it further and figure out financing options. The job is to help identify interventions across different departments, whether it is energy, whether it is industry. In some states, these departments are combined, whether it is forestry, whether it is agriculture, whether it is water, to help understand their priority interventions. And then for these priority interventions, which also impact climate, what can be done? So that's on the SAPCC side. Now, very quickly linking it to how does the last mile benefit? The last mile actually, and I'll sort of come back to the point when someone said that how does the Gaushala lady benefit from a bond? So a Gaushala lady benefits from the bond because the bond actually deploys capital or gives capital to some of these non-banking financial corporations, which are essentially loan-taking, organizations, which then go on to onward lend at the last mile. So they are the people who are talking at the last mile and dispersing sometimes micro loans. A lot of it is microfinance to people who need this kind of money. Now, what happens is, in fact, we had created a policy readiness framework because with the penetration that lending has seen in India in the last 4, 5 years, what was starting to emerge is, and unlike, we didn't want a situation like Cambodia, where what had happened is that you throw a stone and, it lands in one house and there are 20 loans on that house because overlending is what had happened. So in India, we created this policy readiness framework to ensure that the person or the loan disbursement agent at the last mile is sensitized about gender, is aware that this person needs to understand what they are taking the loan for. The Gaushala lady benefits, for example, if she needs to procure, if she needs money for procuring some sort of medicines or, anything that is needed in her supply chain to run her business. Essentially, for her, it's a business where she's sort of has these cows and is going on to sell milk. So for that business, whatever her business needs are, she can go and avail this loan, which is taken from an NBFC. And that loan is then you sort of Pehel Finance was one of the beneficiaries, I do remember, of the bond that I worked on. And that NBFC is raising capital from international markets. In this case, it could be through a bond. It could be through any other instruments. I really want to reiterate that for women, and that's the reason why we've put the link in the chat here to the Maharashtra Climate Finance Access and Mobilization Report, just to see that there is no one size fits all instrument. And I know somebody also asked what kind of financing is available for MSMEs. So you have to understand that different kind of finance is suited for different stages and different interventions. So that mapping is what is very important, and that's where the strategy takes the SAPCC and builds onto it and tries to connect it to the last mile. But I'll pause here and reserve any follow for time for any follow-up questions.
Great. Thank you, Neha, for breaking it down. And in fact, because we are talking about innovative mechanisms, one way of microfinance could also be peer-to-peer lending. And we're looking at there is this company called Rangde, which has been doing great work in terms of taking peer-to-peer lending and capturing the ones who are unbanked. So opening up it for them and leveraging, like all of us can go and actually help the women farmers or micro entrepreneurs get access to credit and invest some of our amount and get some return. So all of us could be kind of lenders or investors in that sense. So that's also one of the innovative mechanisms that we have leveraged for our users for some of these DRE, decentralized renewable energy innovations. To you, Payal, and since we are discussing about bonds, right? And so CPI recently highlighted that there is a Invest Her Climate Resilience Bond as a go-to-market solution. This was in context of Uganda, but I would love to hear from you or know more from you on how this specific bond works on the ground, and how and can this be applicable in the Indian context, especially benefiting the women smallholder farmers, right? So yeah, over to you, Payal.
Thank you, Divya. So, to give you a brief introduction on how CPI highlighted this is the Global Innovation Lab is a branch of CPI which identifies, develops, and launches sustainable finance instruments that can, eventually drive money to the economy. So, this is one of the bonds they highlighted in 2024, if I'm not wrong. But to give you an overview of this, Invest Her is Uganda's first gender-focused climate bond, and it planned on raising $25 million in local currency to bridge the agri-credit gaps. It was spearheaded by Grameen Foundation, which is a not-for-profit based out of US, and targets only women-owned agri SMEs adopting climate-smart agriculture practices. So the core mandate of this bond was that is to build the women climate resilience in agri-food systems. It had followed its own taxonomy where it had definitions for women-led, women-owned, 50% women shareholders should be for a women-owned or owned a small medium enterprise, etc. But this bond works like a special loan pool to help women farmers, and Bond's genius lies specifically in its structure. It followed a commercial structure. It was delivered in two tranches, so to say. One of the deliverable is the commercial angle, where for stability of the bond, and a concessional angle for impact. And it is expected to do this over 5 years. And how it raises money is that the bank issues the bond to borrow about $25 million in local currency from big investors, and investors get steady interest payments back. The use of proceeds from this bond will eventually be used to fund growth stage agri SMEs offering CSA, climate smart agri products, services, and technologies, and which will henceforth enable them to expand their operations in rural communities. In addition, the financial service providers, FSPs, will include rural banks, microfinance institutions, saving and credit cooperative organizations. They will borrow from the bond and issue to on-lend to primary rural women-led agri SMEs. The bond will also, to de-risk all of this, will incorporate a guarantee mechanism to cover a portion of potential losses. This reduces investor risks, and it also had a grant-funded technical assistance facility, a TA facility, which was a sidecar that will engage with business development services and FSPs so that it can give free technical assistance to these SMEs. So it lowers coupon rates, the de-risking facility, and it increases affordability and ensure proceeds flow to only women-centric climate adaptive lending. To give you a recap, 86% of Ugandan working women are employed in the agri-food systems, far exceeding the global 36% average and the sub-Saharan 66% average. And when a lot of women in Uganda are forced to rely on informal credit providers who often give exorbitantly high interest rates up to 25% and per month, and punitive loan terms. So the cycle of economic vulnerability hampers their entire ability to fully invest in and benefit from the agri-food sector. So Invest Her sort of closes that gender gap. And one of the similar structures, what Neha mentioned initially in her introduction, also is taken from IIX Women's Livelihood Bond that raises capital from investor and on-lends it. And this was issued, it's called the Women Livelihood Bond, and was issued in 2017, approximately raising $8.5 million in debt security. And currently it's at, I think, stage 7. and had mobilized by 2025 to $88 million. So it's pretty much replicable in India. Obviously, we'll have to shift to some nuances, Indian nuances, check for market, etc. So over to you.
Thank you, Payal. And this sounds like a very powerful bond, especially because
I
it's
just
focused on
wanted
women.
to come in, Divya, and highlight that not many people know that the WLB, which then became the Orange Bond, has actually deployed $100 million in India. And not a lot of people know about it. So when we were trying to do the second party opinion for it, which finally Sustainable Fitch had done, I had actually reached out to SEBI, and now SEBI has a green bond framework, but they don't specifically have something for orange. So a lot of work that needs to be done, but really good to see CPI's intervention and things that are moving in that direction.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Neha, and thank you, Payal. Yeah, in fact, I feel this bond or this initiative is very powerful. Um, so moving on, and I think because we have some 20 minutes left, so what I'm going to do in this round, I'm going to combine questions that have come on the chat and also a final question. So, Dr. Janak, I think Chitna has already answered that somebody has said that they have no questions for you, but they would love to read your work. And if you could share the platform, and I think Chetna has done that. But sir, like we've spoken a lot in terms of in estimating how much mitigation finance we need, right? And these are some large sectors that we need it for. And even if you look at how RBI has also taken steps towards defining green as a priority sector priority sector for lending, right? What can we do about increasing the finance flow towards adaptation, especially for smallholder farmers and MSMEs, right? In your experience, what mechanisms or interventions could be needed from these institutions like RBI or SIDBI, or even for that matter, for an institution like CSEP, to also strengthen this side of climate finance? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Divya. No, I would like a lot of funds to go towards mitigation. But the fact of the matter, it is not happening. And there are reasons why it's not happening. First of all, it's very difficult to identify, to clearly define. And then, these institutions are, after all, take banks, DFIs or NBFCs, they are, publicly listed companies, most of them. And they are answerable to their shareholders and other stakeholders. So whenever they finance any project, they have to see that they are financing only bankable projects. So since it's very tricky to define adaptable project very clearly, so that's one of the major reasons why is that not happening. And second reason why it's not happening because of the lack of capacity, institutional capacity. Like you need staff, you need know, and if you don't have that institutional capacity, then you are unable to prepare those bankable projects. So I would say one thing we need to do to improve the flow of funds for adaptation is to build the capacity, so that then they are able to prepare the bankable projects and then seek funding. Having said that, I would also say that because these are very difficult to track also, it's not only difficult to identify or tricky to identify or define, but also difficult to track. So that's another challenge. So I would say, like, it's very, I would, though I would like a lot of funding to come for adaptation from all these institutions, but I'm not really sure that would really happen. Most of the funding for adaptation, I believe, would need to come from the public sector. So maybe it's public sector, specifically, targeted at, like DFIs, like they are given that kind of mandate whereby they give funding for adaptation in and then give funding for adaptation. But to expect that the entire funding will come from the banking system, I think that would not be correct. So some from banks, some from DFI, some from the government, everybody will have to chip in. And a lot of funding needs to also come from overseas, like developed countries. They have promised this time under the new collective quantitative goal which they have fixed now, they said they'll be laying more of lot of emphasis on adaptation. So that kind of funding cannot come from commercial organization. Let me tell you, it can come only from philanthropies or public sector. So I would expect a lot of funding for adaptation to come from the outside, particularly from developed countries which are responsible for emission of greenhouse gases. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Janak. Neha, I would like for you to come in and one is, do you agree with Dr. Janak that the adaptation finance has to come from public sectors and largely, let's say, from developed nations? And second is that Taveri from the audience has asked that when it comes to integration of gender components into existing upcoming policies, where do we even begin? Though we have targets, but
How
who
do
do
we
we
sort of
start?
get started?
Yes, how do we get started? And that is also my question to you. Like, while WRI is working, let's say, at the subnational level, how can we accelerate this? Who do we build capacity of? Like
Build
Dr. Janak
capacity.
mentioned that we need to build capacity. So yes, I would like you to
Right.
share a bit
No,
on that.
great questions, and thanks for summing up all of the questions so well. So I'll keep it succinct. To your first point, I agree with Dr. Janak in saying that typically adaptation has been financed by the public sector. So the hope is that the public sector continues to finance it, and public finance sort of keeps putting money over there. But the concern that we're starting to see is that the amount of finance that even adaptation needs today or needs by for the next few years, public finance will not be enough to cover all of it. Now, the key challenge all of us in the panel understand, I'm sure a few participants also know, is that it's hard to finance adaptation at a private level because of the gap or the missing revenue streams that typically adaptation has. So the way I want to push, and this is my modus operandi for the next few years, is to make adaptation intrinsic to moving from a program or a project based conservation or planting a few trees, so sort of evolving even CSR for that matter, to things that are more systemic, things that are more long term, and things that will have a longer impact, possibly sort of integrating it with co-benefits, which is also some of my RBCF, which is results-based climate finance work before WRI India, try to incorporate co-benefits and bring it to the forefront, because sometimes it's easier to finance co-benefits if you see tangible financial returns. And as a finance person, I do know, and it's wrong on us to expect the private sector to come if there are no returns. Why will they come? So we have to start thinking that, how can we make these projects not just bankable, financeable, sustainable for the long term? That is one of my thing. The other thing is we really need to move beyond what I feel is, and I say it very often, is that we need to think beyond capacity building to capability enhancement. We've been doing capacity building for a long time, and if we're still having a discussion in 26 where we say, where do we start? Then I think one is we need to acknowledge that efforts have happened. I mean, today we are in a panel where I think Dr. Janak is a minority. We are more of us here, right? So the conversation has shifted. So you need to give due credit to people before us who've taken that early onus. Now it is upon us to see how can we keep taking it forward. How can we sort of make women empowered? And it's easier to say that empowered women empower other women, but how can you sort of bring more women and give them the confidence to say, if you need a loan, you don't have to ask your husband, you take that decision on your own. And I've been a financial literacy person for a long time, so I often find that even in my sessions for educated people, people would often say that, yeah, tax planning is important, but are we going to do it? Let me go back and ask my brother. So that I think is a mindset evolution which will evolve. I started to see in the younger generation, in the Gen Zs and the Alphas. So it will evolve, but the no matter how difficult the headwinds are, climate right now faces significant headwinds because of the way US has pulled out. No matter how hard, and the onus is on countries like us and people to keep taking the discourse a little further. It may move a little slowly, it may move a little fast. There's organizations in India that Hillary Clinton spoke of, and I'm so proud to have entities like SEVA in India, which have pioneered parametric insurance. And that model can be replicated across other things. So we have, I think the time is to take from pilots to scale. And that will be my final messaging in terms of, how we can take it forward. I think I missed one of the questions that somebody from the audience, I think Taveri asked is, I think we really need to stop thinking of it as a good to have or something that, but bringing it to more mainstream. One of the reasons for the success of the bond I worked on was it wasn't successful because it was a gender bond. It was successful because it was able to give financial returns of 9% to US investors and give a social return of 4%. So when it comes to finance, you have to talk returns and return. When you return capital, more capital will come. Today morning, CEW launched this fabulous 3x3 framework for accelerating private finance. I was part of that session, and it was so nice to hear, and I love it, is that there's no dearth of money. There's dearth of intent, there's dearth of, actionable projects or whatever, but all of these things now need consolidation, which is where stakeholders need to come together and keep taking the narrative forward. So I'll pause at that and hand over back to you, Divya. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Neha. And I think you've kind of summed it up. And I think we all need to come together, especially the point on co-benefits. I think that idea is powerful and we should pursue that. Payal, one is I want to hear from you from on two aspects. When we look at funding or investors, right? Are we missing out on these gender risk signals, like risks that might arise in this whole climate transition story if we miss out on integrating gender as a core theme or as an integral theme? And what would that mean, right? What are the risks or challenges there? The second part is what Dr. Janak also kind of highlighted, that it's also very difficult to track how the adaptation finance flows, how it benefits, right? How do you quantify? Like I heard from Neha talking about social returns, right? So how do you build metrics around it? How do you build like a robust data systems? And going back to where you touched upon in your first answer that gender tagging is missing. So what is missing and what can be built? And what risks are we ignoring today, which could cost us a lot more when it comes to integrating gender?
Thanks, Divya. First of all, I would also like to touch upon the bankability aspect, which Janak sir and Neha to some extent talked about. Let's say if we had a conversation with one of the big banks or FIs in 2019 or 2018 about any of these topics that we're discussing today, they would just plainly say, be not so much interested in our conversation. But honestly, we've seen the shift coming so far. As Neha mentioned, I think we would like to give credit where it's due, and the organizations are trying to build in bankability and trying that the intent is there. We a lot of times within CPI and CSF, which I lead, Center for Sustainable Finance, we try to build capacity and intent of people like big FIs, where they want to understand the bankability of such projects, how they can build in profits, how their balance sheets should look like, etc. So the intent is there, but there's a long way to go. The numbers which we need, which we require as a country globally, are huge. Development, when it happens, there is a 60% contribution of private companies for a country to develop. So when it comes to financing climate and climate needs, I think there will be an equal proportion of that sort of contribution from private companies as well, is what my view is. But coming to your second question, the first question on institutional investor, are they lacking some signs? I think yes, especially the signs that gender risks that should be built in their models. For example, there is a drought and a flood, and women, sort of gets impacted, eroding, their resilience, labor productivity. These nuances are often overlooked in supply chain risk modeling for manufacturing. Similarly, let's say there is a woman of a different caste in a rural area and it faces compounding risks from floods, heat waves, etc., due to limited access to asset, etc. This will inflate adaptation cost for the firm. And this sort of, what is the problem here is that the investors will undervalue it as a stranded asset. In terms of transition risk, when India's, let's say, coal to solar shift is happening, investors usually ignore women's roles in community adaptation, underestimating social license risks, potentially inflating asset valuations by 10 to 20%. So investors should integrate gender audits into scenario analysis to spot these alphas. And in short, pricing gender into transition risk isn't just equitable. I think it's a mispricing arbitrage opportunity in the Indian market. And from a gender lens, I just want to summarize what investors should always keep in mind. And not just investors, like all of us as practitioners, whether financial products are designed to reflect women's needs and constraints, who can access climate finance, and who can really participate in financial decision making from a corporate point of view.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Payal, for summing it up, what needs to be done and how, what perspective or what we need to do, not just investors, but the sector as a whole. I think Dr. Janak wants to come in. Please, sir.
No, I just want to make one quick point. I don't know, we are running short of time. It's not only capacity building at the level of those who need finance, but also those who need to extend finance, like at banks and non-banking financial company, DFIs. Let me tell you, I've heard many people saying that the banks simply don't understand, like whether they will be financing this kind of project or not, because they don't understand them, and in order to save their skin. So I think there's also need to educate the banking community and building capacity at their level. Yeah.
Yes. Payal, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just on that point, this is exactly what we are trying to do at whatever level we could. Like, we're trying to build capacity for the banking community, for them to understand the projects that are coming at their hand. Because at times we feel that the employees are themselves not fully equipped with understanding the nuances of, let's say, a sunrise sector or a new sector, both in mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation mostly more, because in adaptation they generally look at profits, and this is where the needle usually gets stuck.
Great. I think I'm loving the discussion here and the exchange of ideas. I wish we could stretch it for longer, but I know only 4 minutes are left. So thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for coming in and sharing such deep and expert insights. I have definitely learned a lot. Especially the way it started from very simplifying the whole climate finance piece to application of it to missing data and how the adaptation side needs to be designed. So it was super informative, I would say. So thank you so much. Chetna, are there any questions that are left to be addressed in the chat that panelists could take up?
No, no. All the questions are answered. But yesterday I got a call and there was a very interesting question that was asked, was that when we talk about gender, we always talk about women, but there is other LGBTQI community, there are transgender who are overlooked a lot. And they are, when we talk about disproportionately getting affected, their disproportion is way, what do I say, way much stringent. So on that, if we can have a quick reflect from all the panelists, how to get that more inclusive. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, is there is a any comment, anything, Neha, Janak sir, Payal, on that, if you can quickly say
No, I
something.
would say it's a very pertinent question whosoever has raised, and if they are also as they must also be getting impacted, and they should be treated the same way as any other gender. Absolutely.
I would just like to add, in terms of an exercise that can be done separately. Definitely, when we talk about gender, first of all, it shouldn't be just women holistically. In for a transition risk, from a transition risk perspective, we often sort of overlook the impact of a male working in a coal industry at the loss of his job during, let's say, transitioning from a fossil fuel sector to a renewable sector. So these all risks are also very pertinent. And when we talk about all forms of gender here, I feel at a project level, we can conduct a very simple needs assessment so that we can integrate something from a transgender point of view as well.
Great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Payal, and thank you, Janak sir. Yes, Chetna, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Divya. So thank you, Dr. Janak. Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Payal, for this engaging discussion. It was very, very informative for me, and I'm sure for the, attendees as well. There is one Sujay Davangar who want to ask a question. If we have 1 minute, can we let him ask the question in the I'm allowing him to, Hi, Sujay. So if you want to ask the question directly, I have allowed you, so you can unmute yourself and ask the question. I think, hi, hello. Hi, Sujaya. Do you have a question?
Chetna, you're on mute. Chetna, you're on mute.
Okay, so I think we have lost the attendee. I don't know, I'm not able to get through. So thank you so much, thank you so much, Janak sir. Thank you so much, Neha, Payal, and Divya for this engaging discussion. It was wonderful and a lot of information, a lot informative, and I think a lot of us have learned a lot from this. One thing that something going in my mind is as you said, Neha, there is no dearth of money. There is need of actionable project. And also, Payal, you said that we need to educate. Sorry, sir. You said that, sir. You said that we need to educate the banking community, and as you said that we should know where the money is flowing to. So with this, I would like to end this discussion and really want to extend my heartfelt thanks to all the attendees and all of you. We look forward also to again, engage in further dialogues. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So
It is
yes,
fine?
so yeah, it's fine, and we can close it. I think the attendees are also dropping off slowly, so we can close this.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Then see you. Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Thank you. Thank you so much.